John Harper was an ordinary man living an ordinary life, but beneath the surface, he carried a storm of emotions he couldn't quite handle. Life with his wife, Emily, had started with dreams and promises, but over time, those dreams began to fade under the weight of reality. They lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, where bills piled up faster than John could pay them. Every day felt like a battle, against time, against money, and sometimes even against each other. Emily tried her best to keep things together. She worked part-time at a local cafe while managing household chores and supporting John during his low moments. But no matter how hard she tried, it never seemed enough for him. John often came home from work exhausted, frustrated by his dead-end job and the pressure of providing for their family. He would snap at little things, like burnt toast or misplaced keys, and the tension between them grew thicker with every passing day. One evening, after a particularly heated argument about finances, John sat alone in their dimly lit living room, staring at the cracks on the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts of failure, regret, and escape. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered under his breath. The walls of their tiny home felt like they were closing in on him, suffocating him. Emily walked in, her eyes red from crying, holding out a cup of tea as a peace offering. "John, please," she pleaded softly. "We'll figure it out together." But John didn't hear her. All he could think about was how trapped he felt, in their marriage, in their financial struggles, in his own mind. The idea of leaving had been lingering in the back of his head for weeks, and now it consumed him entirely. Without saying another word, he stood up, grabbed an old duffel bag from the closet, and started packing. Clothes, toiletries, a few personal items. That was all he took. When Emily realized what he was doing, she begged him to stop. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to his arm, asking why he was giving up on them. For a brief moment, John hesitated. He looked into her eyes and saw the pain he was causing, but the overwhelming urge to flee drowned out any guilt he might have felt. With trembling hands, he placed his wedding ring on the kitchen counter, a silent goodbye, and walked out the door. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped onto the empty street, feeling both relieved and terrified. Somewhere deep inside, he knew he was making a mistake, but he convinced himself it was the only way out. The sound of Emily's sobs echoed behind him as he drove away, but he didn't look back. For the first time in years, he felt free, but that freedom came at a cost. Little did he know, the decision he made that night would haunt him for years to come, shaping not only his future, but also the lives of people he hadn't even met yet. John Harper arrived in a new city with nothing but the clothes on his back and a duffel bag full of regrets. The bustling streets and towering buildings felt foreign yet strangely comforting, as if the anonymity of the crowd could shield him from the guilt that gnawed at him. He rented a small studio apartment on the top floor of an old building, its peeling wallpaper and creaky floors a far cry from the cozy home he had left behind. But John didn't care about comfort anymore. All he wanted was to escape the past, to keep himself busy and distracted. John threw himself into work. He landed a job at a corporate firm where long hours became his refuge. The monotony of spreadsheets, meetings, and deadlines numbed his mind, giving him little time to think about Emily or the life they once shared. Colleagues noticed his quiet demeanor and assumed he was just shy, unaware of the storm raging inside him. At first, John tried to push thoughts of Emily away whenever they surfaced, telling himself she was better off without him. But late at night, when the city lights dimmed and silence filled his tiny apartment, memories of her laughter and kindness crept back in, leaving him restless. Over time, guilt began to fade, or so he thought. It wasn't that he forgot Emily. Rather, he convinced himself that forgetting was the only way forward. To fill the void, John started dating casually, meeting women through mutual friends or online apps. Some were fun and lighthearted, while others seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him. But no matter how hard he tried, None of these relationships lasted long. Deep down, John knew why. He wasn't ready to open up, to let anyone see the broken pieces of his heart. Each failed attempt left him lonelier than before. Weekends were the hardest, while others spent their Saturdays exploring parks, attending events, or enjoying meals with loved ones. John wandered aimlessly through the city streets. He visited coffee shops, bookstores, and museums, hoping to find some sense of purpose, but everything felt hollow. One rainy afternoon, he found himself sitting on a park bench, watching families play together. A young couple walked by, holding hands and laughing, their joy contagious. For a fleeting moment, John wondered what his life might have been like if he had stayed, if he had fought harder for his marriage instead of running away. Then he shook his head, dismissing the thought as quickly as it came. As months turned into years, John built a routine that kept him afloat. He worked hard, paid his bills on time, and maintained a facade of normalcy. On the surface, he appeared successful, a man who had moved on from his past mistakes. But beneath the polished exterior lay a man still searching for meaning, still haunted by the choices he had made. He told himself he was content, that this solitary life suited him fine. Yet, there were moments, late at night, staring out the window at the glittering cityscape, when he wondered if he would ever feel truly whole again. Little did John know, fate had other plans. What he couldn't see then was that his journey was far from over. Somewhere out there, lives were unfolding in ways he couldn't imagine. And one day, those lives would collide with his own, forcing him to confront everything he had tried so desperately to leave behind. It was a bright, sunny afternoon when John decided to take a break from his usual weekend routine of solitude. He hadn't planned anything special, just a quick trip to the grocery store to pick up some essentials. The weather was perfect, with a gentle breeze and clear blue skies, making it hard to believe that such ordinary moments could change lives forever. As he pushed his cart down the aisles, grabbing cereal, milk, and a few snacks, he noticed something unusual in the distance, a woman struggling to maneuver a stroller through the crowded store. At first, John didn't pay much attention. Grocery stores were always full of parents juggling kids and shopping lists. But as he got closer, something about the woman caught his eye. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and she wore a simple sweater paired with jeans, looking like any other tired parent trying to get through errands. What stood out, though, was the stroller, or rather, what was inside it. Instead of one baby, there were four. Four identical faces peered out at him, their chubby cheeks and curious expressions sending a jolt of recognition through his body. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. The woman turned slightly, adjusting the bags hanging off the stroller. And that's when he saw her face. It was Emily. Time seemed to stop as years of buried memories came rushing back. His heart pounded as he took a hesitant step forward. Unsure if this was real or just some cruel trick his mind was playing on him. "Emily," he called out softly, his voice trembling. She looked up, startled, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. Shock registered on her face, followed quickly by anger. She straightened up, gripping the handle of the stroller tightly, as if preparing herself for whatever might come next. Then, slowly, sadness crept into her eyes, softening her expression, but not erasing the pain beneath it. "John," she said finally, her tone flat, almost emotionless. The sound of his name on her lips sent another wave of guilt crashing over him. Before he could say anything else, she gestured toward the stroller, introducing him to the children. "These are your kids," she said matter-of-factly, though her voice carried an edge of bitterness. Four pairs of wide, innocent eyes blinked up at him, completely unaware of the weight of the moment. They squirmed and giggled, reaching for toys dangling above them, oblivious to the tension between the two adults standing nearby. John felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had left Emily years ago without looking back, assuming she would move on and build a new life without him. Never once had he considered the possibility that she might already be carrying his children when he walked away. Now, here they were, 4 tiny reminders of everything he had abandoned, staring back at him with faces that mirrored his own. I didn't know," John stammered, his words barely audible over the hum of the store. Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Of course you didn't," she replied sharply. "You weren't around to find out." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him speechless. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sounds coming from the bustling shoppers around them and the occasional cooing of the babies. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "We should talk," she said reluctantly, glancing at the quadruplets before meeting his gaze again. "But not here." John nodded numbly, still trying to process what he was seeing. As they agreed to meet later at a nearby cafe, John couldn't shake the feeling that his world had just been turned upside down, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The cafe was small and quiet, tucked away on a side street where the hum of traffic faded into the background. John arrived early, choosing a table by the window so he could watch people pass by while he waited. His mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. How had this happened? Why hadn't Emily told him? And most importantly, what kind of man walked out on his wife, only to discover years later that he had 4 children he never knew about? When Emily walked in, pushing the stroller with practiced ease, John stood up awkwardly, unsure of how to greet her. She gave him a curt nod and sat down across from him, positioning the stroller so she could keep an eye on the quadruplets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, years of resentment and regret hanging heavy like storm clouds. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "You wanted answers," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "So here they are." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Just a few months after you left, I found out I was pregnant with quadruplets. Can you imagine how that felt? Alone, scared, and abandoned by the person who was supposed to stand by me no matter what." John flinched at her words, guilt washing over him in waves. He opened his mouth to respond, but Emily held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't," she said firmly. "I don't need excuses or apologies right now. What I need is for you to listen." She went on to explain how difficult those first few months had been. Pregnant with multiples came with its own set of challenges. Doctor's appointments, medical bills, sleepless nights worrying about whether she'd be able to provide for them all. Her family helped as much as they could, but it wasn't easy. Friends offered support, but nothing could replace the void left by John's absence. "I thought about reaching out to you," Emily admitted, her voice softening slightly. "But then I realized something. You weren't coming back. You made your choice when you walked out that door. So I decided to focus on giving these babies the best life I could, even if it meant doing it alone." Hearing this, John felt a lump form in his throat. He glanced at the stroller, where the quadruplets were happily playing with colorful toys, completely unaware of the weight of the conversation happening around them. Their laughter was infectious, their innocence a stark contrast to the heaviness of the moment. They looked so much like him, the same dark hair, the same curious eyes. And yet, they were strangers. "I didn't know," John whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "If I had known, I would have stayed. I would have done something." Emily studied him carefully, searching for any sign of dishonesty in his expression. After a long pause, she sighed. "Maybe you would have," she said quietly. "But we'll never know, will we? What's done is done. These kids deserve better than someone who runs when things get hard." Her words hit John like a punch to the chest, leaving him speechless. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't deny the truth in what she said. He had run. He had chosen freedom over responsibility, selfishness over sacrifice. And now, sitting here looking at his children for the first time, he realized just how much he had missed. As the conversation continued, Emily shared stories about the quadruplets' early years. Their first smiles, their first steps, the countless late nights spent soothing them back to sleep. Each story was a reminder of the milestones John hadn't been there for, moments he could never get back. By the end of their talk, John felt both overwhelmed and determined. Overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had lost, and determined to make things right, even if it meant starting from scratch. John left the cafe that day with a mix of emotions swirling inside him: guilt, regret, and a newfound determination to be part of his children's lives. But he knew earning Emily's trust wouldn't be easy. She had built a life for herself and the quadruplets without him. And now, after years of absence, he was asking to step back in. It felt like trying to fix a broken vase. No matter how carefully he pieced it together, the cracks would always remain. Their first few visits were awkward and strained. Emily allowed John to see the kids once a week at a local park, keeping a close eye on their interactions. At first, the quadruplets were shy around him, clinging to Emily whenever he approached. They didn't know who he was or why he suddenly wanted to play with them. John tried not to take it personally, reminding himself that building trust takes time, especially with 4-year-olds. He started small, bringing toys and snacks to each visit, hoping to win them over. During one session, he brought bubbles, which quickly became a hit. The quadruplets squealed with delight as they chased the shimmering orbs, their laughter filling the air. For the first time, John saw glimpses of connection. One of the boys, Ethan, tugged on his sleeve and handed him a bubble wand. "You do it," he said excitedly, his big brown eyes shining with innocence. John smiled nervously but took the wand, blowing bubbles as Ethan clapped his hands in approval. It was a tiny moment, but it meant everything to John. Each visit brought new challenges and small victories. There was Mia, the curious one, who loved asking endless questions about anything and everything. John struggled at first, unsure how to keep up with her rapid-fire curiosity. But soon, he found joy in answering her questions, even if some of them stumped him. Then there was Lily, the quiet observer who preferred watching from a distance before joining in. John learned to give her space, letting her warm up to him at her own pace. And finally, there was Lucas, the adventurous one, always climbing or running off to explore. John spent many afternoons chasing him around the playground, laughing despite himself. Emily watched these moments closely, her expression unreadable. Sometimes she seemed guarded, other times almost hopeful. She rarely joined in during their playtime, choosing instead to sit on a nearby bench, keeping an eye on things. John respected her boundaries, knowing he had to prove himself through actions, not words. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, John noticed Mia struggling to tie her shoelaces. He knelt down beside her and gently guided her fingers through the loops. "Like this," he said softly, demonstrating the steps. When she finally succeeded, her face lit up with pride. "I did it," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug. John froze for a second, then hugged her back, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. These little moments added up, slowly bridging the gap between John and his children. Over time, the quadruplets grew more comfortable around him, calling him Daddy without hesitation. It was music to John's ears, though it also weighed heavily on him. He couldn't help but wonder how much easier this could have been if he hadn't walked away in the first place. Emily, too, began to soften, albeit cautiously. She started engaging in conversations with John during pickups and drop-offs, sharing updates about the kids' routines and milestones. While she still held onto her guard, there was a subtle shift, a willingness to let him in, bit by bit. For John, every smile, every shared laugh, and every tentative conversation with Emily felt like a step toward redemption. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. As weeks turned into months, John's role in the quadruplets' lives began to deepen. What started as awkward visits at the park evolved into something more meaningful: shared meals, bedtime stories, and even helping Emily with school drop-offs. Each new responsibility came with its own set of challenges, but John embraced them wholeheartedly, determined to make up for lost time. Emily insisted on accountability, though, and she didn't shy away from confronting him about the past. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, she sat John down in the living room. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of a distant fan. "You can't just waltz back into their lives and expect everything to be okay," she said bluntly, her arms crossed over her chest. Her tone wasn't angry. It was firm, resolute. "You hurt us, John. You left when we needed you most. Do you understand what that did to me? To them?" John nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He had replayed that night over and over in his mind. The sound of Emily's sobs as he walked out the door, the weight of the wedding ring he left behind. But hearing it from her now, years later, made the reality of his actions hit harder than ever before. "I know I messed up," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Emily studied him carefully, searching for sincerity in his eyes. After a long pause, she sighed. "It's not just about saying sorry," she said. "Actions matter, John. Every choice you make moving forward has to show them. And me that you're here to stay this time." From that moment on, John threw himself into being present. He attended parent-teacher conferences, sitting beside Emily as they discussed the kids' progress. At first, the teachers were surprised to see him there, given his absence in earlier years, but John didn't care. All that mattered was showing up. For Ethan, Mia, Lily, and Lucas, he helped with homework, cheering enthusiastically when Mia solved a tricky math problem, or when Ethan read his first full sentence aloud. These small victories felt monumental to John, proof that he was finally doing something right. He also stepped up financially, contributing regularly to cover expenses like school supplies, clothes, and extracurricular activities. It wasn't just about writing checks, it was about being part of their everyday lives. On weekends, he joined family outings to the zoo or the playground, snapping photos of the kids as they laughed and played. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of belonging, a purpose that went beyond paying bills or climbing the corporate ladder. But rebuilding trust wasn't easy, especially with Emily. Their conversations often veered into emotional territory, forcing John to confront the pain he had caused. There were moments when Emily's anger spilled over, her words cutting deep. "Do you have any idea how hard it was?" she'd ask, tears streaming down her face. "How many nights I cried myself to sleep because I didn't know if I could do this alone." John listened silently, letting her vent without interrupting. He knew he deserved every ounce of her frustration. Instead of defending himself, he simply apologized, promising to be better, not just for her sake, but for the kids. Over time, these raw, honest exchanges began to heal some of the wounds between them. While forgiveness didn't come overnight, Emily started to see glimpses of the man she once loved, the man who had been buried under layers of fear and selfishness. The turning point came one rainy Saturday afternoon. The quadruplets were restless indoors, bouncing off the walls despite Emily's attempts to calm them down. John arrived unexpectedly, drenched from the storm, carrying bags of board games and snacks. "Thought you guys might need a little distraction," he said with a sheepish grin. Within minutes, the living room transformed into a lively game zone, filled with laughter and friendly competition. Even Emily joined in, her initial hesitation melting away as she watched John interact with the kids. For the first time in years, it felt like a real family moment, one where everyone belonged. As John looked around the room, catching Emily's gaze across the table, he realized how far they'd come. They weren't healed yet, not completely, but they were working towards something bigger than themselves, for the sake of 4 little lives that depended on them both. As the months rolled by, John's presence in the quadruplets' lives became less of a novelty and more of a constant. He was no longer just the man who showed up once a week with toys or snacks. He was their dad, the one who cheered loudest at school plays, who bandaged scraped knees after playground accidents, and who stayed up late reading bedtime stories until all 4 kids finally fell asleep. Watching them grow brought John a kind of joy he hadn't known existed before, a deep, soul-filling happiness that chased away the emptiness he'd carried for so long. Each child had their own unique personality, and John took pride in learning how to connect with each of them individually. Ethan, the adventurous one, loved outdoor activities, so John started taking him on weekend hikes, teaching him about nature and letting him lead the way with his boundless energy. Mia, ever the curious thinker, enjoyed science experiments, and together they spent hours building volcanoes out of baking soda and vinegar in the backyard. Lily, the quiet observer, found comfort in art, so John stocked up on paints and sketchbooks, sitting beside her as she created colorful masterpieces. And Lucas, the mischievous prankster, kept everyone laughing with his antics, though John quickly learned to keep an eye on him during family dinners, lest he try sneaking dessert before the main course. These moments weren't just fun, they were transformative. For John, every shared laugh, every hug, and every "I love you" from one of the kids felt like a step toward redemption. He wasn't just rebuilding his relationship with them, he was rediscovering himself. The man who used to run from responsibility now embraced it fully, finding purpose in being the father his children needed. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when exhaustion set in, or when guilt over past mistakes threatened to overwhelm him. But he never gave up. Every challenge only made him more determined to be better. Emily noticed the change in him too. At first, she remained cautious, guarding her heart against the possibility of another abandonment. But as time went on, she began to see that John was different now. He didn't shy away from difficult conversations or avoid responsibilities. Instead, he faced them head-on, showing up consistently and proving through actions that he wasn't going anywhere. Their partnership as co-parents grew stronger, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to raising happy, healthy children. One evening, after tucking the kids into bed, Emily and John sat together on the porch, sipping tea under a blanket of stars. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence between them. "You've changed," Emily said softly, breaking the quiet. Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was thoughtful, almost reflective. "I hope so," John replied, looking down at his hands. "I want to be someone they can count on. Someone you can count on." Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You are," she admitted quietly. "They trust you now. And I think I'm starting to trust you again, too." Her word hung in the air, carrying a weight that neither of them could ignore. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was progress, a fragile yet hopeful beginning to repairing what had been broken. For John, those words meant everything. They reminded him of how far he'd come and how much further he still had to go. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. In the laughter of his children and the tentative understanding between him and Emily, he found a second chance, not just as a father, but as a person worthy of love and belonging. Years had passed since John first saw his quadruplets at the grocery store, and life looked vastly different now. The once awkward visits to the park had transformed into weekends filled with laughter, chaos, and memories that John cherished more than anything else. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was an integral part of their lives, a father who showed up every single day, no matter how hard things got. The kids were growing fast, each milestone bringing new joys and challenges. Ethan became the star player on his soccer team, scoring goals that left John cheering louder than anyone else in the stands. Mia's curiosity turned her into a budding scientist, proudly presenting her latest project at the school science fair, a model solar system she built with John's help. Lily's artistic talent blossomed, earning her a spot in a local art exhibition where her colorful paintings drew admiration from strangers. And Lucas, well, Lucas remained the family jester, keeping everyone entertained with his endless jokes and clever pranks. Watching them thrive filled John with pride, not because they excelled, but because they were happy, confident, and loved. Emily and John's relationship also continued to evolve. While reconciliation as a couple wasn't guaranteed, they found peace in their partnership as co-parents. They communicated openly, supporting each other through parenting decisions and sharing responsibilities without resentment. There were still moments of tension, reminders of the past that couldn't be erased, but those moments became fewer and farther between. Instead, they focused on what mattered most, their children, and in doing so, rediscovered a mutual respect for one another. One summer evening, the family gathered in the backyard for a barbecue. The air smelled of grilled burgers and fresh-cut grass, while twinkling fairy lights strung across the patio cast a warm glow over the scene. The quadruplets ran around chasing fireflies, their giggles echoing into the night. Emily stood by the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with John, who held a plate stacked high with buns and condiments. "You've done good, you know," Emily said suddenly, glancing at him with a small smile. Her words caught John off guard, and he paused, unsure of how to respond. "I mean it," she continued. "You're not the same person you were back then. You've earned their love, and mine too, in a way." John felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to thank her, to tell her how much her acknowledgement meant to him, but words failed him. Instead, he simply nodded, returning her smile with one of his own. In that moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most, John realized something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a better future. As the years went on, John continued to grow, not just as a father, but as a man. He learned patience, humility, and the importance of showing up, even when it was hard. He made mistakes along the way, but he always tried to do better, knowing that every effort counted. For the quadruplets, he was simply Dad, the man who played catch, read bedtime stories, and gave the best hugs. To Emily, he was someone she could trust again, even if their bond remained complicated. In the end, John's journey wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. He had walked away once, consumed by fear and selfishness, but he came back ready to face whatever lay ahead. And in the innocent smiles of his 4 children, he found forgiveness, not just from them, but from himself. Life wasn't perfect, but it was whole. And for John Harper, that was enough.